If your last name is on this list, you're not just carrying a family tree, you're carrying a silent penalty, a secret, a banishment or a curse that your ancestors hoped would die out before it reached you. 15 last names, 15 bloodlines, 15 stories that older generations would only whisper about behind closed doors if they mentioned them at all. Some of these names were hunted by the crown, some were branded by the church, and one of them is tied directly to a dark word you've heard spoken your entire life. Stay until the very end because number 2 is the one my own family was warned never to look into, and the final name on this list belongs to a family that refused to surrender long after Ireland already had. Before we go any further, if your last name shows up today, don't just scroll past it. Type it in the comments the second you hear it because I read every single one and I want to see how many of you are walking around with a history you never knew you had. If you're new here, hit subscribe right now because next week's video exposes the last names tied to Ireland's forgotten famine ships, and you will not want to miss it. Let's begin. Before we get into the list, you need to understand something about Irish last names that most people never learn. Almost every Irish name starting with O or Mac isn't just a label, it's a sentence. O means descendant of, Mac means son of. Your last name was never just a tag, it was a claim, a public statement to the entire parish about exactly whose blood ran through your veins and exactly which family would be blamed or blessed for whatever you did next. That's why when a family did something unforgivable or something unforgivable was done to them, the last name was what carried the weight of it, not the person, the name. For generations. Here are the 15 last names that carried more than a name ever should. Last name number 15, Murphy. This is where we start, and it's the heaviest name in the country. Murphy comes from the Old Gaelic descendant of Murchid, built from Mir, meaning sea, and Cuth, meaning battle, sea battler, a name earned in combat. But the meaning isn't why this name carries weight. The man behind it is. One of the major branches of this last name traces directly back to Dermot MacMurrough, the 12th century king of Leinster, who isn't remembered as a hero in Irish history. He's remembered as the man who sold the country. After a massive personal scandal involving an abducted rival queen, MacMurrough was driven from his throne. Instead of accepting defeat, he sailed across the sea and asked the King of England for military help, inviting foreign soldiers onto Irish soil for the first time and sparking 800 years of conflict. Irish schoolchildren are still taught his name as shorthand for betrayal. If your last name is Murphy, you carry the most common name in Ireland, tied directly to the single most cursed decision in the nation's history. Last name number 14, Sullivan. Sullivan comes from the Old Gaelic Uliabeen, meaning the hawk-eyed one, or in darker, hidden translations, the one-eyed one. Local legend across Munster claimed the name marked a family who possessed a strange, unsettling sight, able to see conflict or ruin coming long before anyone else around them could. But when the Great Famine struck, entire Sullivan parishes vanished from the official registers within a single brutal winter. The survivors who managed to flee onto the overcrowded, rotting coffin ships often frantically changed the spelling of their own last name mid-voyage, just to shed whatever the old name had come to mean back home, and to hide from the starvation and desperation they left behind. If your last name is Sullivan, somewhere deep in your bloodline, an ancestor had to completely reinvent who they were and erase their own history just to give the next generation a chance at survival. Last name number 13, Kelly. Kelly is one of the most common last names you will ever encounter, but in Irish history, common never meant safe. Multiple unrelated Kelly clans existed across different counties, and when Oliver Cromwell's forces initiated brutal land confiscations in the 1650s, Kelly families were recorded among the most frequently displaced populations in the entire country. Entire villages of Kellys were forcibly driven out of their ancestral territories and pushed westward into the rocky, barren wasteland of Connacht, a forced migration so devastating it birthed the bitter phrase, "to hell or to Connacht." If your last name is Kelly, your ancestors survived one of the largest state-sponsored ethnic displacements in European history, losing everything they owned, yet managing to rebuild their entire lineage from the absolute ground up on the other side of that misery. Last name number 11, Lynch. If you have ever heard the grim word lynching used to describe a mob execution without a trial, the dark origin story traces straight back to this Irish last name. The legend surrounds James Lynch Fitzstephen, a wealthy mayor of Galway in the late 1400s. As the chilling story goes, his own son was convicted of a brutal murder. When no executioner in the town would step forward to carry out the sentence on the mayor's own flesh and blood, Mayor Lynch allegedly took matters into his own hands, executing his own son directly from the window of his own home to prove to the entire kingdom that the law applied equally to everyone, no matter how powerful. While historians still argue over how much of that terrifying tale is literal truth, every single Lynch family carried the crushing weight of that public execution story for over 500 years. If your last name is Lynch, you carry a name that literally became a warning built into the English language itself. Last name number 11, O'Brien. The O'Briens descend directly from Brian Boru, the most legendary High King in the entire history of Ireland, the man who finally broke the Viking power grip on the island. But legendary bloodlines come with legendary, bitter betrayals. Family lore holds that Brian Boru's own descendants fractured the kingdom apart through infighting so vicious it left the family permanently divided into rival branches that in parts of Munster still refuse to fully acknowledge kinship with each other to this day. This is the exact kind of deep-rooted family fracture that older generations refuse to speak about out loud. If your last name is O'Brien, there is a very real chance your lineage carries an ancient, unspoken family split that your ancestors took great pains to bury in silence. Last name number 10, Doyle. This name carries a darkness that most people who wear it today never realize. Doyle descends from the Old Gaelic dubgal, which translates directly to dark stranger or dark foreigner. It was not originally given as a compliment or an honor. It was a harsh, suspicious descriptor used for Viking raiders and settlers who violently invaded the coastlines and eventually intermarried with local Irish families. That label stuck to their descendants for 1,000 years. If your last name is Doyle, somewhere far back in your bloodline, an ancient clash between an Irish clan and a Norse raider forced two entirely different worlds together, and your family name was minted to make sure nobody ever forgot who your ancestors really were. Last name number 9, Walsh. Here is a historical twist that almost no modern Walsh family expects. The name has nothing to do with traditional Gaelic roots. It comes from the Old Norman word for Welshman, which was used to label the foreign soldiers who arrived in Ireland during the 12th century invasions and simply refused to leave. Over the centuries, Walsh became so widespread across the country that most families carrying it today assume it is purely native, completely unaware that their last name is essentially an ancient administrative tag given by local neighbors to identify outsiders, foreigners, and men from across the sea. If your last name is Walsh, your family name has been quietly announcing for 800 years that your ancestors crossed the border as uninvited guests, even if your blood has been entirely Irish for generations. Last name number 8, Kennedy. While the entire modern world recognizes this name from a single famous American political dynasty, almost none of the actual Irish Kennedys share any relation to them. The name originates from O-Kennedy, which translates bluntly to ugly head or helmeted head, believed to have originally described a fierce warrior who was scarred so brutally in close-quarters battle that his own village struggled to recognize him when he returned home. During the horrors of the Great Famine centuries later, Kennedy families were disproportionately recorded in the grim workhouse ledgers across Clare and Tipperary. That means for every Kennedy who eventually found fame, power, and fortune abroad, there were dozens back home whose final chapters ended inside a destitute building nobody in the parish ever wanted to talk about again. Last name number 7, O'Connor. The O'Connors produced the final two High Kings of Ireland before the island completely fell under foreign control, meaning this last name is quite literally tethered to the end of native Irish sovereignty. When Rory O'Connor, the last High King, officially surrendered to English authority in the 12th century, family tradition records that he was cursed by his own royal bard for choosing to yield rather than fighting to the last man. True or history myth, the O'Connor bloodline fractured violently in the generations that followed, with cousins fighting cousins over whether that surrender was an absolute cowardice or pragmatic survival. If your last name is O'Connor, your family name has been quietly announcing for 800 years that your ancestors crossed the border as uninvited guests, even if your blood has been entirely Irish for generations. Last name number 6. Ryan. Ryan descends from O'Rion, and during the dark centuries when practicing the Catholic faith was strictly outlawed under the brutal penal laws, families carrying this surname were disproportionately tied to hidden hedge priests, brave underground clergy who conducted secret masses out in isolated fields and deep forests to avoid execution by the crown. Family folklore passed down in Ryan households across Tipperary describes ancestors who maintained a hidden room, a false wall, or a heavily guarded forest path specifically to harbor a fugitive priest who would have been hanged on the spot if discovered. If your last name is Ryan, there is a very real possibility that your family's entire spiritual lineage survived only because someone generations ago was willing to risk their life and home to hide an outlaw in the dark.
Last name number 5, O'Neill. If you carry this name, you are tied directly to one of the most powerful and aristocratic bloodlines in all of Irish history, and to one of the most devastating falls from power ever recorded. The O'Neills ruled large parts of Ulster for centuries as near-absolute kings until the historic flight of the Earls in 1607, when the final great O'Neill chieftain chose to flee Ireland from mainland Europe rather than bow to English rule. Almost overnight, a dynasty that had commanded massive armies was shattered and scattered across foreign courts, with nothing left but their name and a permanent grudge. Old Irish tradition holds that the land itself was cursed the night the Earls abandoned it, and that nothing planted on former O'Neill territory grew right for an entire generation. Last name number 4, McCarthy. The McCarthys once ruled the mighty kingdom of Desmond in the south of Ireland, commanding one of the last independent Gaelic territories to stand before English conquest swallowed the island whole. When the kingdom finally collapsed under relentless pressure, family legend claims that the final McCarthy chieftain buried the clan's entire royal treasury somewhere deep on his own land rather than let a single coin fall into English hands, and took the exact location of the gold with him to his grave. Whether or not that hidden treasure was ever real, the story became something the family passed down like a sacred inheritance, absolute proof that even in total, crushing defeat, they kept one final secret that the crown never managed to steal. Last name number 3, Quinn. Quinn descends from O'Quinn, tied to the old Gaelic word for wisdom and counsel, which is almost ironic because the Quinn clans of Clare and Tyrone became infamous across the region for the exact opposite. They were legendary for bloody, multi-generational feuds that dragged on for so long that nobody alive could even remember what original land dispute or insult had started them in the first place. Local folklore insists that one powerful branch of the Quinn family was cursed by a rival clan's priest after a territorial fight turned deadly, a curse that supposedly hunted the family's firstborn sons for 3 generations. Whether people believed in literal curses or not, the Quinns took it seriously enough to alter their eldest sons' names for over 100 years just to break the cycle. Last name number 2, Gallagher. Gallagher comes from Ogulchiver, roughly translated as foreign helper, a name that during the bitter clan wars of Donegal was sometimes hurled as a bitter insult rather than worn as a badge of honor. Certain branches of the Gallagher family were accused generations back of making dangerous political compromises and siding with outside forces during regional conflicts. Even when those accusations were unfounded, the label stuck like tar to the family name itself. Entire households carrying this surname found themselves shunned and isolated by neighboring clans for decades over a single strategic choice made by ancestors nobody living had ever actually met. Last name number 1, Smith. Though many assume Smith is an English import that simply crossed the Irish Sea, the Irish Smith, often an anglicization of the Old Gaelic MacGava, meaning son of the blacksmith, carried a weight unique to the landscape of the island. In ancient and medieval Ireland, the village blacksmith was viewed with a mixture of profound awe and deep superstitious dread. Because they worked with raw fire and unyielding iron to forge weapons, tools, and horseshoes, rural folklore whispered that blacksmiths held secret otherworldly pacts with the elements and that their tools could neither be cursed nor broken by ordinary magic. When the old Gaelic order fell and English authorities began recording local populations, families who bore the trade as a name were frequently targeted first for special taxation or labor quotas because of the vital metalwork they produced. If your last name is Smith, your lineage goes back to the master artisans who shaped the literal iron of the nation, bearing a trade name so universal and powerful it became the most common surname in the entire English-speaking world.
And there you have it, 13 names, 13 bloodlines, and 13 centuries of grit carved into the very stone and soil of Ireland. Every single Irish surname is much more than a simple label or a line on a passport. It is an encrypted archive of survival, a living echo of kings who fell, rebels who hid in the dark, outcasts who refused to break, and families who walked through hell and famine only to plant their flag on the other side. The names change, the generations turn, but the fire that kept those bloodlines alive across 1,000 years of history is still burning right down the line.